Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. A pleasure to welcome to the program Brad Onishi, the writer, co-host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast, founder of Axis Mundi Media, a professor at the University of San Francisco, and author of his second book. Is it your second, I believe?
It is, yeah.
Preparing for War, the Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I did not realize, let's start with this. The idea of Christian nationalism, what's the because we've had a strong sort of extremist, if you will, or fundamentalist Christian presence in this country for decades, maybe a decade and a half, two decades now, almost. Not decades, centuries. But when did it turn into a full-on Christian nationalist movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those questions where we could zero in on decades going back to the 1600s, the 1700s. I mean, we can really talk about the centuries of American and pre-American history, colonial history, and so on. For me, what's helpful is this: if we turn to the 1960s, we see great change in the country. We see a civil rights movement. We see the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, everything from Stonewall to the attempts to get the ERA passed. That's a moment when many conservative Christians in the country, especially many white conservative Christians in the country, don't see progress. They don't see the country living up to its promise to be a more perfect union. Instead, they see that as that's when we lost our country. That's when it was given to those who don't deserve it. That's when rights and representation were afforded to people who are not perhaps real Americans and should not be trusted with the country's destiny going forward.
And so where I didn't realize this, it sort of I guess ballooned into a movement in where you grew up. Let's talk a little bit first about your personal journey, because it gets interwoven here with the rise of this movement.
Sure. So I grew up in Southern California, and I grew up in Orange County. And I know that for most folks around the country, California, they picture California as a liberal bastion where we, the Democratic Party has a supermajority and so on and so forth, right? We teach our kids Das Kapital in kindergarten or something. The reality is it's a much more mixed political landscape. And Orange County in particular in the mid-20th century became what the Harvard historian Lisa McGurr called the epicenter of American conservatism. Orange County is a funny place. After World War II, it was the center, the central nervous system for the American defense industry. So in the decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, you have millions and millions and millions of Southerners and Midwesterners who migrate to places like Orange County. Now, they don't see themselves as transplants trying to figure out how to fit into a new place. They're implants. They're going to bring their culture, their life, and their religious ethos with them. And they're going to do so unmoored from all of the histories and the sedimentation of where they came from. In Pittsburgh, you might have Jewish neighborhoods. You might have large and historic Black neighborhoods. Well, in Anaheim, California, in 1965, you don't have any of that. So you see this sort of distilled form of white Christian conservatism take root in Orange County. And that's what I was born into and grew up in the 1980s. That's where I converted to evangelical Christianity as a teenager. I was ushered into a whole religious political landscape that to me at the time felt normal, but I realized later was really a kind of a central node in the development of what we now call white Christian nationalism. And if you do the history, you see it. You see that this is the region that gave birth to Richard Nixon, my hometown, Richard Nixon's hometown. This is the place that championed Barry Goldwater more than any other in Southern California and in California in general. This is the place that was really Ronald Reagan's spiritual home and named its airport after John Wayne. So, you start to look into it and you realize the deep roots of American conservatism, and somehow they unexpectedly take you back to Southern California.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a couple of actually interviews about the birth of conservatism, or at least the movement conservatism coming out of California. I mean, it ties in also to the medical profession. There was a lot happening in car dealerships. I mean, there's a lot of different narratives there. What I'm fascinated is the idea of this the distillation of the for lack of a better, I keep calling it Christian nationalism, but was it Christian nationalism when it got there? Like the idea that this is a completely blank canvas. Yeah. California, very big country, a lot of people. The whole story about California for much of at least the first half of the 20th century was, we're going out there and I'm starting my life anew in many respects for various reasons that we saw, the Great Depression, but also because it's just so far away from their relatives, far away from legal problems, whatever it was. It's a blank canvas out there. But what was there Christian nationalist Christian nationalists desires before it got there, or did things sort of coalesce there and become more concentrated and virulent?
Yeah, I mean, let's. I think the answer is both and I think if we start with this idea that Christian nationalism, in its essence, is a fusion of the Christian and American identity. The idea that to be a Christian means to be an American, and to be an American, a real American, one needs to be a Christian, right? Those are just a basic working idea of Christian nationalism, that Americanism and Christian identity go together, and that if you separate them, you're left with something that for folks who adhere to this ideology and worldview feels incomplete. Now, folks who are migrating from Georgia, from Pennsylvania in the 50s and 60s, are they going there saying, you know what, I just wish I could be a virulent white Christian nationalist. It's time to get the family in the station wagon and head west? I don't think so. But my argument would be those places had long and deep histories, both religiously, ethnically, and politically, that were different from Southern California. So again, if I'm in Pittsburgh, I'm surrounded by neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, Italian, Polish. I'm surrounded by Catholic folks and other folks, right? So this means that there's a check on my ability politically and religiously to sort of distill this pure white Christian nationalism into my community. There's just things getting in my way to do that. When you get to Southern California in the 1960s, 1970s, all of those things are not there. Those main streets, they're not there. You know what is there? Burgeoning mega churches, where folks are realizing, preachers are realizing, if I combine just vehement anti-communism with all these people who have jobs at defense industry plants, anti-communism, pro-capitalism, pro-individual, you know what that equals? The gospel of Jesus Christ. If I put all that together, now all of a sudden I get a religious and political set of elements that fuse into something that is not only, what I would call white Christian nationalist, but it's unchecked by all those foundational components on the main streets where these folks left. And that's why I think you're able to see this distillation, this petri dish of a conservative movement based on the idea that Christianity and America go together, form in this region of the country.
Well, I'm reminded of Zionism when you're talking a little bit. I mean, there's like this notion that we're migrating to this place. It's a fusion of national identity with religious identity, and one that ends up in a kind of militant right-wing ideology. It makes sense a little bit why Christian nationalists also are such virulent Zionists as well.
There certainly is. And there's this sense, and I think this is something that's important here about land and territory that plays into this. One of the things we're seeing out of some of the most, I think, disturbing strains of Christian nationalism right now is an emphasis on Volk and homeland. Those are words that are quotes from like very popular Christian nationalist manifestos that are being read by pastors and seminarians as we speak. So this emphasis on land and people coupled with a story of Israel as a kind of chosen place, and America superimposed it's the Israelite story onto its own, you really do get a mix that leads to a Christian Zionism, past and present.
I want to move to your personal journey for a moment, and then broaden back out again. But before we do, which values come from where? In other words, like, it's a combination of Christianity and American national, but it's a specific vision of what America is based upon where these people are coming from. It's a very conservative, I think white supremacy based, patriarchal, like,
Yep.
which part is American and which part is Christian? Like, I understand the way that it's been fused, but was it always fused?
Yeah.
Can we delineate which came from where?
I think we make a mistake if we get up in the morning and we think of the political realms and the religious realms as these, separate domains that sometimes interact. That sometimes there's this Venn diagram of religion overlapping with politics. I think it's more helpful to think of them as co-generative. One of the words that the religious right used back in the 70s and 80s, when it was the religious right and not Christian nationalism in terms of terminology, they would call themselves co-belligerents, right? That they were like stirring up and agitating together as political entrepreneurs and as pastors. And that's how I would think about it. I would think about it like, if you take someone like Jerry Falwell, one of the progenitors of the religious right in the 1970s, what he's doing in the late 1970s is he's going around the country on a tour, but it's not a religious revival tour. It's called I Love America. He's holding rallies saying, I love America. Like, there's a gospel choir. And at the end of those rallies, he has an altar call for America. And so I guess for me, the more helpful way to think about it is that for the majority of white Christians, they've never really cultivated a Christianity that has been separated from a sense of Americanism or nationalism. Now, at times, there have been forces that have tamped that down, that have unraveled it, that have put the jets, cooled the jets. But as we've seen in the last decade, there's also been times of deep cultivation and activation and, dare I say, acceleration. And so I don't think it's one influencing the other as much as two symbiotic elements growing together to reach what I think now is a pretty destructive force in American society.
I think it's difficult for like secular type people to conceive of it this way, almost in the same way. I mean, I make this argument about, misogynists and racists don't see themselves as holding two different, I'm a misogynist and a racist. It's no, I don't like people who are other than me and not conforming to my notion of hierarchy. But there was a time where there was a sensibility, at least amongst some cohort of fundamentalists, leave unto Caesar that which is of Caesar. Mm-hmm. We stay in our sacred world. We don't involve in the profane world. When did that? I mean, I know that Jerry Falwell was largely, and Paul Weyrich and these folks were largely responsible for bridging that divide. But was it hard for the congregation to join them, or was that because it feels like the system is set up in such a way that, like, unlike a more secular, a group of people, turning their direction in one way or another is like, is herding cats or changing a flight deck. But one of the advantages that I would imagine a Christian community has is the pastor stands up and says, that stuff that we were believing yesterday, I found out last night it was wrong. And so today, this is what we believe.
I think there's some of that at play. I think one of the ways to think about it, and I think the sociological data shows this, is whether it's the 1970s and Jerry Falwell, or whether it's 2020s and the MAGA movement and its fusion with white Christian nationalists. Christian nationalists are motivated to enter the political sphere in force when they feel their cultural identity is under threat. So let what Caesar's be unto Caesar is a lot easier when you feel like you're Caesar implicitly, right? Which means white Christians are the leaders in Congress and in the White House. They're the people on TV. They're the people who control what's going on culturally, economically. And again, why would I start my book in the 60s? Because that's a moment when you see all of a sudden a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, a Stonewall that starts to threaten the white Christian and starts to make them feel as if they are under threat to be a minority in the country. But that has only accelerated over the last 50 years to the point where we got to 2016 and the election of Trump. And so I guess what I would say here is, how do you get those white Christians motivated to march, to rally, to protest at Planned Parenthood? You convince them that they're going to be replaced. You convince them that they're under threat. You convince them that the government hates God. Even though Joe Biden goes to mass like 3 times a day, you convince them that there's never been a Democrat who's ever been a religious person, and so on and so forth. And that sense of threat is a great motivator, whether it's in the 60s and 70s protesting the civil rights movement, whether it is protesting Obergefell, whether it's trying to put an abortion ban in place. It's all based on that sense of we will be replaced if we don't act, and we need to act now in order to save our country and ourselves.
And I'm fascinated by the usage of religious iconography and justifications and grafting that onto political realities, whether it be Southern California is Eden, or whether it be Donald Trump is sacrificing himself for our sins, and he's an imperfect vessel for our political goals. That is so I mean, if you could just explain that, as someone who grew up secular, the usage of those religious modes of thinking and applying it to politics.
We really see this at January 6th. A lot of so many of my colleagues, religion scholars, have done great work in addition to what we've done on our show to point out the deep and wide religious symbology at January 6th. Christian flags, appeal to heaven flags, Proud Boys wearing patches with the Psalms quoted on them, icons of Mary, statues of Jesus, prayer circles. Why? And I think the response with January 6th, and I think in general to your question, Emma, is that there's a sense when you invite people into a story that has a sense of transcendence, a cosmic significance, you're able to mobilize them in a way that perhaps you couldn't, without it. As Sam said, on the left, there's often this pluralistic and diverse coalition that has a hard time agreeing. Well, if you invite people into a cosmic story that says we have to act now, that Donald Trump is not just a candidate who maybe likes some of the policies you like, but he's been chosen by God to save this country from a woke globalist apocalypse. You're able to usher some folks into a movement and usher them in with urgency that you might not have without those religious or pious symbols. And so I think they have a really important function in these movements, past and present.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Democrats are trying to do a similar thing in terms of saying that he's an existential threat. It's a lot harder to do because we do not have a framework for any of it. And we don't have those, we don't have that natural cohesiveness. And that we don't have the sort of accoutrements, I guess, to maintain that. Is it, when these directives come down, how much of it is, who's the policeman? Is it God? I know it's even just, I know the act of sort of pulling these strains apart is conceptually not how it works. It's really just a way for us to understand. But how much of it is God, or is it, that the vehicle for God is my pastor, or is it the community? Mm-hmm. When I go to, to dinner, or I go to friend's house, where are the different forces of maintaining discipline?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's helpful is to think about something like Christian nationalism as a an identity and as living out a story. That if we do what my first year students do all the time and say, hey, religion's about belief, right? We're just going to learn about what Hindus believe and what Buddhists believe. We kind of get off track, because what it's really about is an identity that gives people a character to play. There's some data out there that shows us that there's many people who haven't been to church in a long time who will tell you in a survey that they think the federal government should declare this a Christian nation, that they believe our laws should be based on the Bible. And yet you say, that's great, Jeff. When's the last time you went to church? And they say, can't remember, maybe 2020, right? And so what that tells me is this is about an identity and a story to play. Well, then the question I think you're asking, Sam, is, well, how do I plug into that story, right? How do I plug in and play a part? And what we're finding increasingly is, yes, it's pastors and churches. They're important. But those pastors and churches are just part of a kind of a network of voices. And those voices are, across the media landscape. They're across the political landscape. So one of those is going to be Trump and his MAGA lieutenants. Others are going to be the Charlie Kirks and the Ben Shapiros and the others in the right-wing media. And so by the time somebody enters church on a Sunday, there's a really good chance they've had 8 or 10 podcasts, YouTube channels, other outlets, Fox News and Newsmax, that have informed their understanding not only of politics, but of religion. And so if their pastor doesn't confirm that, what we're finding is they often are just going to find a new pastor. So if you're a pastor in this day and age, even if you're not a hardcore MAGA person, you really have to make a choice. Do I get on board, save my job, probably get a couple hundred more people in the door on a Sunday? Or do I disagree, take a stand, and probably find myself without a job or a career and just kind of have to start over, even though I'm 48 and I've never done anything else? So I guess my point here is, I think we need to see the cultivation of this discipline and this worldview as multifaceted, but it's all sort of disciplined by, are you on board with it as understood as a broad conservatism outlined by Trump and the elites at hand, and those come down to family, they come down to gender, they come down to immigration, they come down to sex, and those have been raised to the level of doctrine, right?
It's fascinating though to me that and I get the idea that, okay, it's not just Charlie Kirk is more relevant to me than my pastor if I'm a Christian. It's Charlie Kirk and Fox and Friends, and Matt Walsh and whatever. I've watched all these, and so that's my sense of reality.
Yep.
That comes crashing up against what my pastor may say, but the pastor's supposed to have a more direct line. It's fascinating to me that the pastor has to bend. I mean, you see this all the time. You see this in all religions. I know I've known people who've been rabbis at big temples, and they're like, I couldn't handle it but part of it was, certain ideological things in the past. And I imagine that happens, but it's not so much, it's usually one thing. It's fascinating to me that. So here's my question then for you is, how did you break out of it or fall out of it? I mean, it's less, it's more, it seems to me that's more of a question of how you drop out of it than you do drop into it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for me, I converted at 14, and I was a pastor by age 20 as a full-time minister.
Wait, why did you convert at age 14?
Well, I got invited to church by my girlfriend, and my thought was, it's Wednesday night, and
now
my girlfriend. So it's Wednesday night. There's no way mom's letting me out of the house. I've been getting in a lot of trouble. So if I tell her I'm going to church, she's going to say yes, because she thinks that's going to straighten me out. My plan was find girlfriend. Once we get to church, sneak off into the field, make out, and then then church is a good deal for me. What happened was I had this incredibly extreme conversion. I met all these folks at the mega church that convinced me that God would forgive me and provide me eternal life, and that this was the answer to all my existential questions. And so I was the kind of kid by the time I was 15 or 16 that told my mom, I don't want Christmas presents. I want you to spend any money you're gonna spend on Bibles for people in Nepal or elsewhere, because they've never heard of Jesus, right? So I really went from this kid in a non-religious setting to an extreme convert. I was completely devoted. So by the time I'm 20, I'm a minister, and I'm married to my high school sweetheart, and I'm getting ready for seminary.
She the one that you went to the church with?
No, the one that invited me to church dumped me like very quickly after. I mean, she could tell I was choosing Jesus and not her. She
Right.
saw the writing on the wall.
You
She
got
saw the
too
priorities.
into it, Brad.
Yeah, I blew it. Yeah. So she dumped me, but Jesus didn't. And I stuck around. And so all that to say, I'm not somebody who just had some interaction with this culture. I was a foot soldier. I was a completely devoted disciple. The problem for me is my mind is way too active, and I started to read. I wanted to understand the ins and outs of our doctrine, of our history. I wanted to understand where we came from and how and why we got to where we were. And then things started happening like 9/11. And 9/11 happens. And in my church, this brings out Americanism in a way I'd never seen before. And it was not that I wasn't mourning and traumatized along with so many other Americans at what happened on 9/11. It was that it started to feel like our religion was more about the American flag than the cross that was in the front of the church. And so that was a moment of like, why did 9/11 lead to something like Iraq and Afghanistan and all of that? I remember wanting to vote for John Kerry and not George W. Bush the second time around. I told my elders at the church I was going to do that, and they said, that's cute. We're glad you think John Kerry's going to help people with education or healthcare, but he's for abortion, and that means he's a murderer. Do you want to be a murderer? And I was old enough by then, in my early 20s, to say, this can't be the only way. Like, we can't reduce the most fundamental questions of human life to like either or, can we? Like, there have to be theologians and mystics and philosophers who've done this in a way that's more complex. So instead of becoming a missionary like everyone wanted to, I went off to England to go to graduate school at Oxford. And when I got there, I was unmoored, just like many of those folks from Orange County before me. There was nothing holding me in place. I was able to read and think and really explore intellectually every avenue I wanted to go down. And I realized very quickly that the gospel I'd been converted into was a gospel as much about an American story than it was about Jesus Christ. And so that led me on a path of a much different kind of worldview.
Your story is both sort of like, is fascinating, but it's also, it's a little bit depressing.
Yeah.
In the sense that, your average person in any sector of life does not have that level of curiosity. Or, on some level, it sounds like your Christian nationalism was done in by your purity to Christianity, and combined with a curious intellect. That's not your average person in anywhere.
Yeah.
So like it doesn't suggest that there is an easy way out of this for a lot of people.
I think you're right, but I think here's where I take hope. I went back to Orange County just about a year ago to talk about my book, and I met with so many people I used to know at my former church, and they're not those that are at graduate school. These are folks who are just going to work and raising their kids, and so many of them said, "Hey, I'm so glad you wrote this book because I left 5 years ago. I left in 2016 after Trump. I left when George Floyd was murdered, and I saw the reactions to my church to that set of events." So I think there is hope in knowing that there are run-of-the-mill people out there who are saying to themselves, what I've learned about my Christianity doesn't line up with Trumpism or the xenophobia or racism or et cetera that I'm witnessing in my religious space. So I think one of the things that's easy to do is despair and think that Christian nationalism is this sort of majority force in this country. It's far from that in terms of numbers. And there are many who left after 2016. I think the problem is there's a lot more who are being seduced into it by way of patriarchy, xenophobia, and misogyny and nationalism to kind of reinforce some of the pews and those churches. So I think there is hope, but I think there's also reason to be incredibly fearful about what's ahead.
Well, give us some of those numbers, because I have to say, just because we like to do a little doom casting around here. I don't think you need a majority, frankly.
Of course not.
I think you need a very virulent small minority, and almost definitionally, we're talking about, that type of sort of mentality. Like, it doesn't take much of like people who are sort of really invested to make a big change in this country, and particularly in this era of minoritarian rule. So give us a sense of numbers, but also talk to me about, like, my sense was that Mike Pence was, prior to Mike Johnson, the most powerful theocrat, Christian nationalist that this country has ever had in terms of like an elected official. And that he served Trump in two different ways. One, to represent the establishment and at least the sort of the business community through the Koch brothers network that he was very, very heavily invested in and invested of, I guess. But also he was the one who delivered the evangelical Christian nationalist vote. Does Trump need him anymore? Like, how is that vote being delivered? Bush needed the marriage equality amendments in 2004 to win a majority. Trump needed Pence, it seems to me, to get to at least to win the electoral vote. What's going to fill that gap this time around for Trump? And give us a sense of numbers in terms of what we're talking about.
Sure. So we have, in 2016, we have just about 80% of white evangelicals vote for Donald Trump. We have about a majority of white Catholics. So that gives you a sense of the demographic. Now, in 2020, that goes up. So more white evangelicals voted for Trump by percentage, at least, in 2020. So,
but did the raw numbers of evangelicals who voted? I mean, I imagine, particularly at that time, I'm not surprised to hear that the percentage of those who voted did, but did the raw numbers of those people grow in the same, consistent with the increase in the percentages?
Yeah, the answer is complicated, but I think this is part of what we're seeing in 2024 is a shift on the part of Trump and many leading lights in the Christian nationalist movement. Dutch Sheets, Lance Wallnau, Charlie Kirk, they are really focused on Black, Latino, and Asian Christians because they feel like they've maxed out some of that white Christian vote. Like, you can only get so much of that group. And those numbers are not necessarily growing. There's numbers out there that actually tell us that the numbers of white evangelicals in the country have gone down. What does that mean? It means there's no accident you're seeing an increase. All these news stories, all the coverage of Black voters for Trump, of an increased Latino vote for Trump, of an increased Asian American vote for Trump. That's due to a strategic targeting of those folks. And how are they doing it? Well, they're offering a Christianity based on patriarchy, based on quote unquote family values, based on gender hierarchy, based on there's only two genders and so on. So the point I think here is 2024 is a moment where you're seeing them realize if we can peel off some of those people of color and Black voters, that's where we're gonna backfill, and that's where we're gonna perhaps increase our voter reach. So I think that's answer number one. I completely agree that you only need a minority. Like if you look at the numbers from Pew or PRRI, we're talking about 30 to 40% of the country score as Christian nationalists in some way. They appear on what we would call the Christian nationalist spectrum. My colleague Paul Jupe, however, at Denison University found in a recent study that about 9 to 10% of Americans believe only Christians should be citizens. He found that 14% of Americans believe that the church should have a veto on the government's policies. The thing about the groups we're talking about today, and I think, Sam, you already know this, and the audience probably already knows this, they vote in incredibly high numbers. Right? They don't stay home. These are not folks who are going to sit it out and protest. These are not folks who are going to say, I'm just don't think I'm going to be there this time. I have to run errands. I can't make it to the polls. These are people who vote in numbers that are well beyond the average American group. And so you only need a minority. Once you factor in gerrymandering, once you factor in voter suppression, you really do have a recipe where 30% of the country can dictate what happens for everybody.
What's the strategy? I mean, are you aware of what the strategy is or the tactics? Because I think like the idea that they talk about, blacks for Trump, what they're really saying is specific black Christians for Trump. And Latino voters, we're playing on the conservatism there. I mean, I think, like, frankly, the biggest, we're in the midst, obviously, Harris or Biden as the candidate. I think the idea of Harris as a candidate, I think the rewards outweigh the risk, or the potential rewards, or the risks are less than they are with Biden at this point. But one of them certainly is the fact that Harris is a woman, and this is going to, that even more than the fact that she's black, it in my estimation, is going to motivate a different cohort of people than would have otherwise voted to vote against her, because the idea of having a woman as being in charge is so antithetical to that some of these sort of like that will appeal to the cohort of Christians that Trump himself could not.
It will. I mean, Kamala Harris is like made in a lab to scare the white Christian nationalists. I mean, Barack Obama
to scare the white ones, without a doubt. But they're already going to vote, it seems to me, in those numbers. I'm talking about Latino communities, and even perhaps black communities, although I would imagine like Latino communities, there would be more inspiration there. The idea of a female president.
Sure. I mean, well, I don't want to deliberate too much on Kamala Harris's presidency, her presidential candidacy that could or could not manifest. I will say she's a complicated figure in many ways, complex for a lot of folks. She represents the United States in its best form. She's a mixed race person. She's a black person. She's an Asian American person. She has a Jewish husband. I mean, this is America in 2024. For others, that's going to be used against her. It's going to be used against her even in some of those minority ethnic communities. So I think that's a reality. I think the answer, though, to your central question, Sam, is really this. How do you convince the black church, the Latino church to vote for Donald Trump, given his stance on the border, on immigration, on race in general, the Central Park Five, whatever it may be? And I think the answer is, let's look to people who we see in front of us. Byron Donalds, Herschel Walker, folks like this. The key here is to emphasize, what do you want for your country? Do you want a country built with strong men, strong families, based on a husband and a wife, men and women, no pronouns, no non-binary, whatever that means? Do you want to have groomers and perverts in your schools, or do you just want to have a candidate who will support what is the right kind of sex, the right kind of marriage, the right kind of love? Do you want that kind of country over there with the rainbow flag and the gender spectrum? Or do you want strong men leading you into an uncertain future where we are at threat in every turn? That's the sell. The sell is lean on the patriarchy, lean on the gender structure, lean on the sense of the otherness that you talked about earlier. Who is other than me? Well, the people who are lesbian, gay, non-binary, the people who are trans, they're more other than you than the folks who are telling you that Joe Biden is better for the person of color. Be more afraid of them, be more angry at them. And that works in many of these churches. It works in many of these spaces. And so that's the sell. And that's the play.
That's why they call her the DEI. That's why the Post, I think, called her the DEI Barbie. Or
they couldn't print the N word. So
but the point is that by saying the DEI Barbie instead of the N word, they can then sort of appeal to people of color and say, like, she still represents alienness. Well, even though in some areas, I mean, and that's the point, is that they've been able to sort of like convert slightly the terminology so that it can apply. It's sort of like a all-purpose racist otherization that can work, meet the sort of the bigot where they are in some way. Well, I have one also final question because this I think plays a very big part in what we're seeing with the Supreme Court is Opus Dei. My understanding is that Scalia and Alito, at least, are Opus Dei. That Leonard Leo, who has orchestrated essentially the Supreme Court via the Federalist Society for a couple of decades, also Opus Dei. I know that Kudlow, I think, is also who was Trump's chief advisor. How does Opus Dei play with this Christian nationalism? Are they just cousins, essentially?
No, they're I think one of the things that I've tried to get across over the last few months is that radical traditional Catholicism, right? This very overwhelmingly conservative strain of Catholicism, of which Opus Dei is a major part in that ecosystem, is at the center of what we now understand the Christian nationalist movement in this country and everything that's happening at the Supreme Court, as well as Project 2025. So let me lay it out. The Heritage Foundation is behind Project 2025. Who starts the Heritage Foundation? Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich was a radical traditionalist Catholic. After Vatican II, he started going to a church that where the mass was in Greek because he couldn't stand the vernacular. He broke with his own church because he thought they were too liberal. If you look at the life of Paul Weyrich, he is a strict male supremacist. He's a Christian supremacist, and he is somebody who believes that a dominant patriarch should be the head of the house, the church, and the government. Who is now in charge of the Heritage Foundation? Kevin Roberts, also a traditional Catholic. Okay, so there's a long lineage of the Heritage Foundation having this vision of Christian supremacism. They believe Christ is king, not in religious pluralism. They believe that their Christian values should be infused throughout the government without any question. They believe that male leadership is the way to go, period. So it's no accident to me that Kevin Roberts gets out there in public the other day after the immunity ruling and says, if the left will allow it, we'll have a bloodless revolution. That's a traditional Catholic leading in the lineage of Paul Weyrich, who is articulating that they are so excited for a unified executive in the vision of Project 2025, where a male patriarch will have almost complete control of the executive branch and perhaps the entire government. It's also what we're seeing in SCOTUS. So one of the arguments I made in Politico a couple months ago is that the IVF rulings represent the Catholicization of American sexual ethics. That evangelicals in the 60s were not against abortion. Evangelicals up until recently were not against IVF. But IVF and abortion have been traditionalist Catholic issues for a long, long time. So when you see the Alabama Supreme Court ruling on IVF, or you see the Southern Baptist Convention condemn IVF, they're doing so at the influence of those traditionalist Catholics you're mentioning, the folks who are not only affiliated with Opus Dei, but who are running the Federalist Society, and in many ways are driving the conversation about gender and sex within those communities. So if there has ever been a moment of overwhelmingly conservative Catholic forces dominating our politics, it is now, whether you look at the Supreme Court or Project 2025. Project 2025, in its essence, is a rad trad fever dream.
So not cousins, more like grandfathers, fathers of
leaders of the household.
How do they manage to be like? I would say that 70% of what we've talked about, our audience is familiar with in some fashion or another. But I would say there's a much smaller group of people who are, Opus Dei we were talking about Opus Dei more in the aughts.
Yep.
Than we are today. I think Novak, who was a Washington Post writer and was on Crossfire, was Opus Dei. But it seems to like they got the message. And Opus Dei has always sort of been a little bit secretive, as far as I understand. But they got the message that like we need to recede at least. I mean, has that happened? And how has that happened? And And how conscious of that was that?
Well, I think there's a sense there of sometimes less is more. Sometimes less name recognition is more. I mean, I think we're seeing this with Trump and Project 2025, right? You're seeing more and more Americans understand what Project 2025 is. So he comes out with this incoherent rant about how he has no idea what it is and he doesn't believe any of it. Well, if you don't know what it is, how do you know you don't believe it? He's just basically trying to do, damage control. It's the same with Open State. If we recede into the background, right? Slowly, drip by drip, what we see over the course of the aughts and the Obama years is so much funding, so much network building, right? So much political influence coming into cultivation. By the time we get to the Trump years, it's the Federalist Society who picks us 3 judges, right? By the time we get to 2022, 23, 24, we have people like the Southern Baptist Convention and a Supreme Court justice in Alabama condemning IVF. I mean, that is an overwhelming victory for the likes, not only of Open State, but anyone in that traditional Catholic universe. They feel enormous victory, and I dare say enormous momentum right now. Leonard Leo's at a place where he's like, I got the court.
He's got $1 billion. People have forgotten this, but he was given $1 billion with a B dollars to basically go be an authoritarian entrepreneur. Wherever you can push this agenda, do it.
We've already got the court in his mind. That's what he's thinking. And so let's go get the state legislatures and let's go get Congress. I mean, and make Congress even worse than it is now. I mean,
well, that controversy, just to add to it, with the kicker from the Kansas City Chiefs, Harrison Butker, that he was speaking at a college where Leonard Leo has connections and has donated, as well as Josh Hawley, having connections to that too.
Leo was the commencement speaker the year before.
Yep.
Right. So here we have Harrison Butker, 28-year-old kicker, and the year before it was Leonard Leo. And so I think that, I mean, it just follows along everything you're saying, Emma.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. And
good thing the Democrats are in a great position to beat this back right now.
This is your cue, Brad, to say something like, "Oh, but here's the good story."
Well, I mean, look, I mean, I think for me, here's a couple things we could take away. Perhaps is we got news of stunning left center victories in France over the last couple of days. Yeah. Labour is in power in the UK, and the Tories are gone after 14 years. Whether we look to places like Mexico or the pushback on Modi in India, there are people across the world saying no to fascism. And I think for me, the hope lies in a message that says, look, Biden, Harris, whomever, we have a chance to say no to fascism. We have a chance to say no to totalitarianism. And there are people across the world who've already signaled that they understand the threat and they're doing the same. So yeah, I'm not going to prognosticate, and I'm never going to take the foot off the gas of trying to reveal to people just what a dire situation we face right now, because we do. But there's always hope, and hope springs from organizing and togetherness. And if people are willing to like rub shoulders with other human beings, you often feel a sense of momentum and a sense of hope grow. And so that's my encouragement. Go do one thing you don't usually do. And don't sit on the sidelines as we kind of descend into what could be a summer of despair.
Brad Onishi, writer, co-host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast, founder of Axis Mundi Media, author of Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. We will put a link to that book at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thanks, Brad.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.